Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. Thank you for downloading. My name is Renee Manderville, a project manager at the Indian Ocean World Center, or IOWC, at McGill University. I am joined by Dr. Philip Gooding, a postdoctoral fellow at the IOWC and co-editor of the recently published volume, Animal Trade Histories in the Indian Ocean World, Palgrade 2020.
Hi, Renee. Thank you again for having me on the podcast. And to our listeners, you'll hear from me again later after our guest has spoken.
Our guest today is Akash Ondaatje, a master's candidate for the Queen's University Department of History, who on July 13th successfully defended his master's thesis under the supervision of Drs. Jane Arrington and Andrew Janeshaw. Today, Akash will discuss his thesis, entitled Animal Ascension, Elevation and Debasement Through Human-Animal Associations in English Satire, 1700 to 1820. Throughout his ongoing research, Akash has contributed to the historiographic tradition that has endeavored to illustrate the centrality of animals to the comprehension, critique, and crafting of human societies, with a focus upon the long 18th century. He intends to continue his research by entering a PhD program in 2021 after a year of working with archival sources. So Akash, welcome. We're so happy to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Hi, Renee and Philip, and I'm excited to discuss my topic with you.
So as a starting point, could you just elaborate on your thesis? So what were some of the key historical studies that laid a foundation for your research? How does your thesis fit within the tradition of animal history? Further, maybe you could explain to our listeners what constitutes as a long 18th century and why you chose to focus on that period. And lastly, why you chose to ground your thesis in a study of satire and what made satire a successful channel/medium for the distribution of human-animal hierarchies.
Yeah, all right. I'll just pull this up. So as far as secondary sources, my research was significantly inspired by the works of Dr. Keith Thomas at Oxford, and especially Man in the Natural World, which he wrote in 1983. The text, I believe, laid a foundation for many ensuing studies of animals in the early modern period and demonstrated the interconnectivity of a vast array of social and political factors in England from roughly 1500 to 1800 that's centered around human-animal relations. In addition to Thomas, Harriet Ritvo's The Animal State, more recently Erica Fudge and Virginia DeJohn Anderson's works have provided studies of the early modern period leading into the Victorian era that expand upon the role of animals in our cultural and intellectual history writing. Especially Anderson has also expanded the geographic scope of that analysis. In Creatures of Empire, she brings these ideas to the North American theater. So when I decided to research in the current of animal history, I knew I couldn't tackle a time frame as large as Thomas, and I finally settled upon the long 18th century. This coinage, the long 18th century, has been used by numerous historians to better encompass the natural progression of culture and politics in England. And some authors, such as Frank O'Gorman, famously have identified the beginning of the long 18th century as far back as the Glorious Revolution, 1688. For my study, I settled upon 1700 to 1820 for a variety of reasons. 1700, first and foremost, because I'm primarily interested in the works of the Scriblerus Club, an informal, semi-formal grouping of authors and academics and thinkers, namely Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, who formalized their group in 1714, but whose works predate that year. So I wanted to acknowledge those early works. The 1714 is also the year of the Hanoverian succession, and most of the monarchs for which the satire that I investigate is concerned are the Georges, George I, II, and III. Finally, I decided to culminate my research in 1820, both because many of the authors and artists who I investigated had passed away by that date, but also because I wanted to make a concerted effort to differentiate animal ascension from the more established historiography of animal rights, which began notably in the 1820s with Richard Martin and the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act, and continued through the founding of the SPCA in 1824 and onwards. So that was my thinking as far as the temporal scope. So you'd asked about satire. The 18th century has long been closely identified with satire, as well as caricature, the visual counterpart. And the abundance of primary sources made it possible to discern common threads relating to animals quite easily. And satire, by nature, being a disruptive force that flourishes best with a democratized readership or relatively democratized readership, coincided well with the disruption of human-animal hierarchies. And so the medium seemed appropriate right away. Then through my research, I came to appreciate how the satirists themselves harbored strong views in regards to animal treatment and their position, and was fascinated by how they used various species in the ridicule of human individuals in society. I began to compartmentalize the various associations until it became clear that 18th century satire was simultaneously elevating animals while debasing humans. And this led to my formulation of animal ascension. I think, yeah.
Thank you for your answer, Akash. That's very interesting. So I suppose moving more into detail, in the second chapter of your thesis, you elaborate on traditions in the animal vocabulary and discuss how these manifested in the long 18th century. While discussing an interculturalist approach to fable creation, you state that lineages of animal fables should be generally understood as a series of revisions within a transcultural labyrinth of exchanges. So do you mind explaining this statement to our listeners and maybe just discussing the relationship between animal ascension, Orientalism, and interculturalism in the long 18th century, as well as in its literature and storytelling in general?
Of course. Well, my period of study was the 18th century, but many of the traditions with which the satirists I discuss engaged had lineages that were far older. The animal vocabulary was intended to position some of the key traditions historically, so as to make my subsequent analysis more fluid. And fables are one of these traditions, perhaps the oldest of those considered. The German Orientalist Max Müller, who I reference in my thesis, would elaborate on the intercultural connections in his lecture and article in 1870 titled On the Migration of Fables, where he notes the various incarnations of fables and the collection of colloquial proverbs and popular thinking, and how, working backwards through La Fontaine and Socrates and Aesop, we can notice that there are trends that far extend past the boundaries, the geographical boundaries of England or Europe. And he specifically notes that the prevalence of animal fables in Sanskrit literature, to him, suggests that the former may have had their principal source in India. In my research, I don't go as far as to suggest a date or location of the inception of each fable. However, I felt it was important to stress the transcultural nature of oral traditions and folklore and not assume a constrained Eurocentric geography. Many of the 18th century authors were themselves interested in Orientalism as it was understood at the time, and some sought to incorporate elements in their works. Byron is well known in this regard, so too are Shelley and Coleridge, while Dryden's fables were noted by Pope himself as for some time inspiring him to write a Persian fable, as he called it. And of course, there was this surge in missionary activity and travel during this time that created new channels for animal fables and animal associations in foreign texts to make their way to Europe. And it's important to value these appropriately because they influence the popular European and English imagination to the point where there's cycles of preconceptions that are ultimately informing the activities and the views of future travelers and future colonists. There were also efforts during this time to formalize the study of these foreign texts, and early modern Orientalism in England created such posts as the Sir Thomas Adams Professor of Arabic position at Cambridge, and numerous other translations also came out of this tradition leading into the 18th century, the Jataka tales, the Panchachantara, and many texts which contained animal allegories. fables aren't the only tradition of the animal vocabulary that inspired styles and subjects of 18th century satire, but they do embody a central pillar of animal ascension in that they are didactic and contain a moral education, which is quite key. Christian parables, which are another tradition of animal vocabulary, similarly employ animals as a teaching device. Here we can see a slide of Durer's The Prodigal Son, which depicts a well-known Christian parable referencing the debasement that an individual would conceivably relate to in regards to animals, and how this is integral to their ultimate salvation and conversion experience. So whether through storytelling, images, or preaching, animals are present in a prodigious number of lessons communicated in early modern England. And this other image here is from Francis Barlow's version of Aesop's Fables in the 17th century.
All right, thank you so much for those answers, Akash. So I think that might conclude my questions. Philip, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple. Thanks, Renee. Thanks, Akash, as well. Firstly, I'm interested in understanding how certain animal species came to be defined and evaluated by human standards of civility and sociability. And how and why were certain species treated differently and afforded varying privileges?
Yes, so I stress in my thesis that both humans and animals and human and animal behavior could be subject to praise or criticism, deriving chiefly from conceptions of civility and sociability. Though commentators were generally sensible and mindful of the relative faculties of each species, all species could nonetheless be judged to an extent upon their operation within and use towards human society. For animals, this would manifest in a preference for certain species over others, based in part upon such qualities as domesticity, grace, or organization, while for humans, it could result in being vilified or otherwise depreciated to the rank of animals, or in fact below animals. One of the major works that anchored my study of the concept of civility, or civilité, was Norbert Elias's The Civilizing Process in 1939. Elias discusses the removal of violence from the scenes of social life, and through a fascinating history of table manners and social norms, touches upon many of the ways that the treatment of animals in the West and the concept of civility were defined by their antithesis and brutishness or paganism. So being juxtaposed with brutishness, paganism, or in fact barbarity or wildness, the Europeans crafted their identity and image. And both humans and animals came to be considered in relative fashion based upon these qualifications. While it might seem shocking that animals be deemed civilized and a human be labeled barbarous, this was in fact exactly what occurred time and time again in the 18th century. Of course, there was a variability in regards to the expression of civility or sociability dependent on the species in question. Anatomy and movements could be considered graceful, for instance, as in the case of the Arabian horse or a purebred dog. These two species are two of which I consider privileged species in my thesis, meaning they came to be highly valued and were given attentive care and often intended to reflect and project in some manner the qualities of their owner. This privilege does not mean, however, that all members of these species were treated gently, and in fact many were tortured or killed according to the whims of humans. But it's important to keep in mind that that there was a hierarchy of animals separate from the hierarchy of humans and animals. Another animal commonly associated with grace and civility were birds. This has been recently presented by Peter Salins in his book 1668, The Year of the Animal in France. He discusses the use of birds in the courts and the royal menagerie at Versailles. And it's a fascinating example of learning through animals and the intent behind a monarch wanting his subjects and wanting his courtiers to acknowledge his place within the natural order as well. There are similar examples of animals being employed as as civilizing agents in England and throughout the 18th century. Pope and William Hogarth and many of the individuals I studied in this paper had strong attachments to their animal companions and often communicated their belief in species-based relativism while evaluating civility. A different kind of praise was heaped upon animals that worked in large numbers or which crafted or created structures that were deemed architectural. Here we speak mainly of insects, for instance, bees and spiders. The bee, or an arachnid, I suppose, in the case of a spider, the bee was an extremely popular symbol in the early modern period, leading into the 18th century, even being labeled the virtual paradigm of neoclassicism. And it appears in Manderville's Fable of the Bees, The Grumbling Hive, as well as countless poems and short stories. And the hive and the busy bee came to be two images that were didactically employed to promote social cohesion and laboriousness and similar virtues that could be gleaned from the life of these insects. Napoleon, by the turn of the 19th century, would famously adopt the bee as a symbol for France in similar fashion, which I discuss in my chapter on animal ambassadors. And spiders, meanwhile, in crafting their webs, were often concurrently applauded and vilified. Spider associations might have on occasion suggested a clever mind, but were more often than not used to attack a human subject as conniving or malicious. And they were notably associated with the satirists themselves on many occasions. I think I have a few images here. These are some images of facial comparison, facial symmetry, physiognomic portraits. So one of the other traditions, in addition to fables within the animal vocabulary, is physiognomy, and this is one of the foundational texts by Giambattista della Porta. And on the right here, we have an example by Rowlandson, an 18th century English caricaturist using very similar faciality. And again, here, Charles Lebrun, who would lecture throughout Europe on physiognomy, and physiognomic practice was very much an entire ethos and way of thinking, not just in this aesthetic style, but as far as caricature was adopted as such. And here, in regards to what I was just discussing about animals in large numbers, on the right you have Cruikshank the British beehive, which is kind of this iconic, slightly after the period of study that I'm interested in, but it's nonetheless important, I think, to be amazed by how in the span of a century, human beings came to be so commonly associated with animals that their entire society and social organization could be viewed through the prism of animal society. And on the left, there's two prints, two engravings from Hogarth's The 4 Stages of Cruelty, which depict the Dive evolution, the degeneration of the protagonist Tom Nero, who begins his journey by torturing animals in the streets of London and ends it on the anatomy table with a dog kind of sniffing his intestines to kind of show, you know, the progression of where animal cruelty will ultimately lead to barbarity and to be treated like a savage. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that answer. I really appreciate your identification of how the human-animal binary doesn't really hold, and this is part of a broader discourse about the blurring of the human-nature binary, which is very popular in, I suppose, capitalist scene discourse at the moment, which seems to get really fleshed out here. Also, something that's really interesting about the animal seen as civilizable or sociable. It's notable how many of these come from the Indian Ocean world, and very much these sociable or civilizable animals, or the ones that are perceived as such, were very much the ones that were demanded by European royals to be brought back on ships from the Indian Ocean world for display in royal menageries. This is really, really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for elucidating that. But I suppose departing from that as well, I want about the role of religion. For context to our listeners, throughout your thesis, there is significant emphasis on the relationship between religion and animal elevation or animal ascension. So would you mind elaborating on the role that religions, both Abrahamic, but also possibly some from the Indian Ocean world as well, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, so Islam being an Abrahamic religion as well, had on influencing the philosophies and theories of varying levels of animal autonomy and human debasement?
Yeah, that's a major topic, and I'm not sure I'll be able to adequately introduce it all. But it's very important though, and the Abrahamic faiths, to put it broadly, and it should be noted that there's an immense variability of animal practice in each faith and each locality. But Christianity in particular, as the dominant faith in England at the time, in particular, was appreciated in 18th century England, or pardon me, as it was appreciated in 18th century England, afforded humans with a great many privileges based upon conceptions of human exceptionalism and supremacy. We've already briefly touched upon Christian parables and as a teaching device, but in the prelude to the period of the Scriblarians, there's another major discussion being had in regards to animal faculties and the dominion over nature. And this is, of course, to do with René Descartes in France as in the previous century, and Michel de Montaigne and their debate over Descartes' concept of the beast machine, or the beast machine theory. This was immediately of interest in England, and from editions of The Spectator and Joseph Addison's writings on it to the Scriblarians themselves, there's much discussion that I tried to summarize to some extent in my thesis. Descartes essentially proposed animals worked along the basis of automation and were not governed by a discernible reason, and thus were in fact much like machines. And Montaigne's more relativist approach acknowledged varying degrees of reason, and like the Scriblarians to come, stressed that each creature's faculty was honed to their position within the natural world and to their specific needs and functions. The prevailing Christian conception of the great chain of being, pardon me, right here on the left, we have one of the most common depictions of the great chain of being, and on the right, an English example from the 17th century. So the prevailing concept of the great chain of being had ordered humans and animals in a rather static hierarchy. And yet, while that's quite clear from simply looking at the image, some historians, such as Catherine Chevallot, have remarked that while the great chain of being was a model of hierarchy, it also implied some troubling interconnectivity and ambiguity. She argues, in fact, that it blurred the distinctions between various orders of creation, for if a chain is to remain intact, its links must intersect and overlap. So it's interesting, I think, that by associating humans so definitively above animals, the Christian theory, Christian theology and theorizations, how that a certain responsibility was required of the former in relation to the latter. It can be argued that the great chain held humans and animals closer than Descartes' early modern formulations. So contrasting Christian conceptions of human-animal hierarchy with Buddhist or Hindu philosophies can be slightly troubling, and it's easy to anachronistically assume that contemporary thinkers and audiences were well versed in these faiths and structures. And while Oriental cultures were studied, and obviously we've discussed how they were of great interest, it's difficult to speak to how well they were understood. And definitely some of the more superficial expressions of animality through faith, for instance, theriocephaly, animal headedness, the condition of having an animal head, which are commonly depicted among Hindu gods or Egyptian gods, would most likely represent a pagan other to Christianity that it sought to distance itself from. Though, interestingly, when dealing with the Scriblarians and early modern humanists and neoclassical writers, it's important to identify their interest in the Greek tradition and their writings concerning Arcadia and the dominion of Pan, which contain numerous hybrids and human animals, and it's very reminiscent of a kind of their version of paradise or a state of nature. So there's, I think it's a very complicated web to untangle, but there's definitely an infinite amount of various different conceptions of human animal hierarchy based around religion.
Yeah, thanks for that. For a very good summary for what was a very broad question. So apologies for making it.
No, no, no.
You dealt with it very well. So thank you very much for that, Akash. In fact, that is, I think, my final question. Renee, do you have another one?
Yeah, I think so. So thank you, Philip. Akash, in the 5th section of your paper, you elaborate on the animalization of races beyond those within Europe at this time, specifically the animalization and savage narrative that developed towards indigenous peoples within North America throughout the age of exploration. So because our center obviously focuses on the Indian Ocean world and thus the indigenous peoples of Africa, Asia, and Oceania, rather than in North America, I suppose I'm just wondering how settler colonialism in general and global cultural exchange in the 18th century intensified the fears of decivilization and intensified savage narratives, as well as how animals figured into the crafting, expression, and defense of civility.
That's a really great question, and it was an important part of my thesis that was actually one of the when I began this paper, I thought to only focus on that angle and on cultural exchange in North America, and then it kind of expanded outwards. But it's a captivating part of early modern thinking towards animals, and it also represents some of the most detrimental animal associations that unfortunately in some cases have a continued legacy today. Many of the traditions of the animal vocabulary and the associations of the 18th century were brought to the colonies and where they took on new significances. One of the definitions of civility that some early modern thinkers such as Henry Home, Lord Kames discuss has to do with the stages of civilization. In other words, the belief that in a teleological manner, humans have maneuvered their way through logically evolving stages and in the process exemplified certain behavioral patterns. Indigenous peoples in North America, for instance, were commonly theoretically positioned in a lesser stage, state of being, and were deemed savage. Animal associations helped compound these distinctions. So, for instance, Virginia John Anderson notes a case study of colonial Virginia where in the mid-17th century, if an indigenous hunter were to kill a wolf, which was considered an undesired animal, their bounty would be a cow, and while the bounty of a non-indigenous person would simply be payment in currency. The Virginia Burgesses believed that this would civilize the Indian and also subsequently introduce into Christianity, as the possession of domestic animals fulfilled the scriptural injunction that humans exercise dominion over the creatures of the earth, and this was a responsibility that indigenous peoples ignored. So animals were used in that sense as a projection of civility. Now, colonial realities were such that it's rare to see that colonial realities and colonial ambitions perfectly sync. Many compromises arose immediately, and animal elevation husbandry, for instance, had to be adapted to the new lands and climate, and indigenous technologies were crucial to the survival and successes of colonial ventures. This cultural exchange and reliance and friction scared arbiters of civility and authorities, and who hypothesized that European settler colonists would themselves decivilize, being far from the metropole. There was a newfound impetus to protect and to project civility. So an example of protecting civility can be found in the work of Sarah Hand Meacham, who discusses a 1768 case study of Jonathan Boucher, a very interesting case study of a man who loses his dog. Ostensibly, someone steals his dog, and he, in a backbreaking manner, seeks out a new English dog of the type popular with gentry in England. And he hoped that such an animal would announce his hoped for status as an English gentleman, even if he was stuck in provincial Virginia. And he didn't wish to obtain a mongrel type of dog, and as was common in the colony. But instead, this breed that he sought would ostensibly reaffirm both his masculinity and refinement. So both in terms of protection and projection of civility, they take on new meanings in the colonial sphere. One of the primary sources that I worked with in particular was the Abbé Raynal's Philosophical and Political History of the Settlements and Trade of the Europeans in the East and West Indies in 1798. And this presents a troubling case study of animal associations that suggest the consequences of how animal elevation and human debasement were adopted to the case of indigenous peoples. There's a painting on screen here by George Catlin, slightly later into the 19th century, but Renee would similarly write of the qualities of bears and speak of their hunting by indigenous peoples as the two being appropriate to one another based on their strength and elevation. And then he turns to the case of the beaver, who, like the spiders previously discussed as an architectural animal, he notes that a beaver possesses all the friendly dispositions fit for society without being subject as we are to the vices and misfortunes attendant upon it. And he describes at length their government in terms of a whole body republic comprised of companies and neighborhoods, and their social life, which draws tears of admiration and pity from the humane philosopher. Subsequently, having implied that indigenous peoples were naturally more inclined to certain animal practice, he notes that if we compare the manners, the police, the industry of the beavers with the wandering life of the savages of Canada, we shall be inclined to admit, making allowance for the superiority of man's faculty above those of animals, that the beaver was much further advanced in the arts of social life than his pursuer. So it's a striking example, but it's not too uncommon. And I'm sure there's boundless similar examples to be found in the context of the Indian Ocean world at this time or during the Age of Discovery. And I know that Ruma Chopra in her book Almost Home discusses the case of maroons in Jamaica and how bloodhounds were used to flush them out of difficult terrain, and how the practice of using bloodhounds in that regard was already deemed barbarous and savage in England. But there was this idea that because of the physique and racial status of these maroons, it was somehow more appropriate or even just acceptable. And the ways in which these associations influenced colonial policy is another topic worth investigating, slightly outside the boundaries of my paper. But for instance, Francis Bond Head, the would-be Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, in 1847, he writes of the assimilation of indigenous peoples in terms of animals. And he notes that one might as well endeavor to persuade the eagle to descend from the lofty region in which he has existed, to live with the fowls in our courtyards, as to prevail upon the red men in North America to become what we call civilized. In short, it is against their nature and they cannot do it. So, you know, this has lots to say about the historical legacy in regards to race of animal associations, and how we account for certain atrocities and violences committed to different peoples. There's a quote by Daniel Paul that I always keep in mind, where he writes, if they can convince themselves that the people their ancestors brutalized, dispossessed, and in many cases exterminated were little more than savage animals, then they don't have to face up to the horrors committed by these ancestors. After all, when you simply put down pests and varmints, who should complain? So yeah, you know, here on screen there's an image of a children's book, an ABC for Baby Patriots, and there's earlier 18th century and examples of children's books being used in a similar way, kind of compartmentalizing geography and peoples through animals and being an important colonial tool.
Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Akash, for presenting to us today and for answering our questions. Good luck with your ongoing work. We will be very much looking forward to hearing about it in the future. Thank you to Philip Gooding for his questions today. And thank you to you, our listeners, for downloading. Once again, my name is Renee Manderville, and you have been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.